The morning shift at Brookhaven Manufacturing began like any other Tuesday in October. Daniel Reyes clocked in at 6:47 a.m., 3 minutes earlier than usual, his steel-toed boots clicking against the polished concrete floor as he made his way to Station 12. The familiar symphony of industrial machinery hummed around him, conveyor belts whirring, hydraulic presses sighing, and the distant clang of metal on metal that had been the soundtrack to his working life for 8 years. At 34, Daniel had earned a reputation as one of the most skilled craftsmen on the floor. His hands, calloused but precise, could coax beauty from raw wood and steel with an artistry that made even Marcus Hale, the perpetually scowling floor supervisor, nod with grudging approval. Today's assignment was a batch of custom cabinetry components for a high-end residential project, the kind of work that required the delicate balance of power and finesse that Daniel had mastered through years of patient practice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He ran his fingers along the grain of a pristine oak board, feeling for imperfections that his trained eye might have missed. The wood was beautiful, its natural patterns telling a story of seasons and storms weathered in silent strength. Daniel smiled slightly, thinking of Leo, who would be getting ready for school right now, probably struggling to tie his shoes and definitely forgetting to brush his teeth, unless Sophia Ramirez, their neighbor, reminded him. The boy was everything to Daniel. Since Maria's death from cancer 3 years ago, Leo had become not just his son, but his purpose, his reason for rising before dawn and working until his shoulders ached. Every paycheck, every careful cut, every precisely drilled hole was for Leo's future college fund deposits, baseball equipment. The bicycle they'd been saving for that would replace the too small one currently gathering rust in their garage. At 9:23 a.m., everything changed. The accident began with a sound Daniel would replay in his mind for months, a grinding screech of metal under stress, followed by a mechanical hiccup in the rhythm of the primary cutting assembly. Daniel looked up from his workstation, his craftsman's instincts immediately alert. The massive overhead crane that moved heavy materials across the factory floor had developed an irregular sway, its safety cable visibly fraying under a load that should have been well within its capacity. "Hey, Marcus," Daniel called out, pointing toward the crane. "Something's wrong with the rigging." Marcus Hale barely glanced up from his clipboard, dismissing Daniel's concern with a wave. "It's fine, Reyes. Keep working. We've got quotas to meet." But Daniel knew the signs of equipment failure. He'd seen machinery pushed beyond its limits before, had witnessed the devastating consequences of ignoring warning signs in favor of production schedules. The crane was carrying a load of steel beams destined for the automotive assembly line, easily 3 tons of unforgiving metal suspended 30 feet above workers who trusted that someone, somewhere, was ensuring their safety. The cable snapped at 9:24 a.m. Time dilated in that horrifying moment, seconds stretching like taffy as Daniel watched the massive load begin its fatal descent. The beams tumbled in slow motion, their trajectory carrying them directly towards Station 8, where Tommy Martinez was operating the industrial lathe, completely unaware of the death falling toward him. Daniel didn't think, he ran. His boots pounded against the factory floor as he sprinted toward Tommy, shouting warnings that were lost in the machinery's roar. He reached his coworker with seconds to spare, tackling him away from the lathe just as the first beam crashed into the workstation, obliterating everything in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. But the other beams were still falling. Daniel tried to roll clear, tried to follow Tommy to safety, but his momentum carried him directly into the path of a secondary collapse. A support beam, knocked loose by the initial impact, swung down like a pendulum, and Daniel, in his desperate attempt to save another man's life, couldn't escape its arc. The beam caught him across both forearms, as he instinctively raised them to protect his head. The sound of breaking bones was lost in the larger symphony of destruction, but Daniel felt it. A sensation like snapping tree branches, followed immediately by a cold, spreading numbness that made no sense until he looked down and saw what remained of his hands. They were gone, not cleanly severed, but crushed beyond recognition. The bones of his forearms shattered so completely that what hung from his elbows bore no resemblance to the skilled hands that had shaped wood just minutes before. Blood pooled beneath him on the concrete, mixing with hydraulic fluid and sawdust, to create a slick, dark stain that would haunt his dreams. The factory fell silent except for the hiss of escaping steam and Tommy Martinez's sobbing. Workers gathered in a horrified circle, their faces pale with shock. Someone was shouting for an ambulance. Someone else was trying to apply pressure to wounds that couldn't be stopped. Marcus Hale stood at the edge of the crowd, his clipboard forgotten. His face a mask of calculation rather than concern. Daniel's last clear thought before the medics arrived was of Leo. His son would be in Mrs. Jennings' third-grade class right now, probably working on the multiplication tables they'd practiced together the night before. In a few hours, someone would have to tell a 9-year-old boy that his father, his hero, his protector, the man who could fix anything, was broken in a way that couldn't be repaired. As the paramedics loaded Daniel onto a stretcher, he caught a glimpse of his destroyed workstation. The oak board he'd been preparing lay split down the middle, its beautiful grain pattern now marred by impact damage and splattered with his blood. The parallel felt too cruel to contemplate, but as consciousness slipped away from him, Daniel couldn't help but wonder if his own story would end the same way. Something once whole and strong, now shattered beyond any hope of restoration. The ambulance screamed through Brookhaven's narrow streets, its siren a wailing announcement that another family's world had just collapsed. And, in a small elementary school across town, Leo Reyes continued working on his math problems, unaware that his father's hands, the hands that had taught him to tie his shoes, to hold a pencil, to believe he could build anything he imagined, would never hold him again. The antiseptic smell of St. Mary's Hospital had become as familiar to Daniel as sawdust and machine oil once were. 3 weeks had passed since the accident. 3 weeks of surgeries, consultations, and the gradual, crushing realization that his hands were never coming back. Where his forearms had once extended into capable fingers, there were now rounded stumps wrapped in pristine white bandages, changed twice daily by nurses, who spoke to him with the carefully modulated voices reserved for the irreparably broken. Maya Patel arrived on a Thursday morning like a small hurricane in scrubs, her dark hair pulled back severely and her eyes sharp with professional assessment. She was younger than Daniel had expected for an occupational therapist, probably early 30s, with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had seen too much human tragedy to waste time on false comfort. "Mr. Reyes," she said, settling into the bedside chair with a stack of files and what appeared to be a small suitcase full of mysterious implements. "I'm Maya Patel. I'm here to help you figure out how to live your life." Daniel turned away from her, facing the window that looked out on Brookhaven's modest downtown. "I don't think there's much life left to figure out." "Self-pity hour is from 2 to 3, Maya replied with startling bluntness. "It's 9:30. Right now, we're working on breakfast." She opened her case and began laying out devices that looked more like medieval torture instruments than helpful tools. There was a curved metal fork attached to a leather strap, a cup with an enormous handle, and something that appeared to be designed for holding a toothbrush at an impossible angle. "These," Maya said, "are going to become your new best friends. This is a universal cuff. It straps to your arm and holds utensils. This is a weighted cup for stability. And this lovely contraption helps with oral hygiene, because even if you feel like giving up on everything else, your teeth still deserve better." Daniel stared at the collection of adaptive equipment with undisguised revulsion. "You want me to eat with that?" "I want you to eat, period." "When was the last time you fed yourself?" The question stung because they both knew the answer. Daniel had been allowing the nurses to spoon-feed him like an infant, too humiliated to even attempt the basic act of nourishment. The few times he'd tried to maneuver food to his mouth using his arms, the results had been disastrous: spilled soup, dropped sandwiches, and a shame so profound it made his throat close up. "Look," Maya continued, strapping the universal cuff to Daniel's right arm with efficient movements, "I know this isn't what you had planned for your life, but you have a choice here. You can lie in this bed feeling sorry for yourself until they transfer you to long-term care, or you can fight back." She placed a spoon in the cuff's grip and positioned a bowl of oatmeal on the bedside table. "Show me what you can do." The first attempt was a disaster. Daniel's arm, still weak from the surgeries and unfamiliar with the weight distribution of the cuff, moved too quickly. The spoon shot past the bowl entirely, clattering against the table's edge. His second try knocked the bowl sideways, sending oatmeal across the surface in a beige, lumpy mess. "Shit," Daniel muttered, then looked up sharply. "Sorry, I've heard worse," Maya said dryly, cleaning up the spill with practiced efficiency. Again. The third attempt managed to capture some oatmeal, but when Daniel tried to lift it to his mouth, his coordination failed him completely. The spoon tilted, dumping its contents down the front of his hospital gown. The fourth attempt was worse. By the fifth, Daniel was breathing hard, his face flushed with exertion and humiliation. "I can't do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm useless." Maya paused in her cleanup, fixing him with a stare that could have melted steel. "You know what useless looks like, Mr. Reyes? Useless is giving up. Useless is deciding that because something is hard, it's impossible. You saved Tommy Martinez's life 3 weeks ago. Does that sound useless to you? That was before. That was you, the same you that's sitting here right now, feeling sorry for himself instead of figuring out how to be a father to his son." The mention of Leo hit Daniel like a physical blow. His son had visited every day since the accident, but their interactions had become increasingly strained. Leo would sit quietly by the bedside, showing his father's schoolwork that Daniel could no longer help with, talking about baseball games he could no longer catch. The boy was trying so hard to be brave, to pretend that nothing had changed, but Daniel could see the fear in his eyes, the growing understanding that his father might never again be the capable, strong man who had been his whole world. Just yesterday, Leo had brought his math homework, a worksheet of long division problems that had always been challenging for him. In the past, Daniel would have pulled out a pencil and worked through the problems step by step, showing Leo the patterns and shortcuts that made the numbers manageable. Instead, he'd been forced to sit helplessly while his son struggled, offering only words of encouragement that felt hollow and inadequate. "I can't even help him with his homework," Daniel said, the words coming out thick with suppressed tears. What kind of father can't help his own kid? Maya's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "The kind who's temporarily figuring out a new way to do things. Leo doesn't need your hands, Mr. Reyes. He needs you. Your brain still works, your heart still works, your voice still works. Are you telling me that's not enough?" She began setting up the eating exercise again, this time with a smaller spoon and a fresh bowl of oatmeal. "Tommy Martinez sent you a card. It's in your bedside drawer. His wife wrote it because his hands are bandaged. But he wanted you to know that his daughter still has a father because of what you did. That little girl doesn't care that you don't have hands. She cares that her daddy came home." Daniel looked down at the adapted utensil, its foreign weight strange against his arm. The simple act of feeding himself, something he'd done unconsciously for 34 years, now required conscious thought, deliberate coordination, and an acceptance of failure as part of the learning process. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long what? How long before I can do this without making a mess?" Maya smiled for the first time since entering the room. "That depends entirely on how stubborn you are. And Mr. Reyes, something tells me you're very, very stubborn." They worked for another hour, Daniel gradually learning to modulate his movements, to compensate for the absence of finger dexterity with shoulder and elbow control. By the end of the session, he'd managed to consume nearly half the bowl without any major catastrophes. It wasn't graceful, and it wasn't pretty, but it was progress. As Maya packed up her equipment, she paused at the door. "There's a 9-year-old boy out there who thinks you hung the moon. He doesn't care if you can't tie his shoes or help him build model airplanes. He just wants his dad back. The question is, are you going to show up?" After she left, Daniel sat quietly in his bed, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. The man looking back at him was a stranger, gaunt, defeated, fundamentally altered. But behind the bandages and the hospital gown, behind the fear and the shame, something small and stubborn was beginning to stir. Maya was right about one thing. Leo needed him. Not his hands, not his ability to fix broken toys or help with homework, but him. The father who had read bedtime stories and taught him to ride a bike and promised him over and over that they would always figure things out together. Tomorrow, Leo would come for his daily visit. Tomorrow, Daniel decided, he would be sitting up in bed, eating his lunch with those ridiculous adaptive utensils, showing his son that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you need to learn how to be strong in a completely different way. Home felt like a museum of his former life. Daniel had been discharged from the hospital on a gray November afternoon, and now, sitting in his own living room for the first time in 5 weeks, every familiar object seemed to mock him with its inaccessibility. The television remote lay on the coffee table, impossibly complex without fingers to navigate its buttons. His toolbox sat in the corner like a monument to obsolescence, its contents now as useful to him as artifacts from an ancient civilization. Leo had been subdued since his father's return, hovering nearby but maintaining a careful distance, as if afraid that too much closeness might somehow cause more damage. The boy had grown thinner during Daniel's hospitalization, his face carrying a gravity that belonged to someone far older than 9. Sofia Ramirez had done her best, cooking meals and helping with homework. But there were things, the bedtime stories, the reassuring presence during thunderstorms, the quiet confidence of a father's protection that no neighbor could replace. It was during one of these awkward homecoming dinners that Daniel first noticed Leo's real struggle. They were sitting at the kitchen table, Daniel managing to eat spaghetti with Maya's adapted fork while Leo pushed his own food around his plate, lost in thought. Between them lay an open math workbook, its pages filled with long division problems that had been assigned 3 days ago. "How's the homework coming along?" Daniel asked, nodding toward the book. Leo's shoulders sagged. "It's hard. Mrs. Jennings says we have a test on Friday, but I don't understand the borrowing part. When you borrow from the tens place, where does the number go?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken frustration. In the past, Daniel would have pulled the workbook closer, taken Leo's pencil, and worked through several examples, his strong hands guiding his son's smaller ones through the mechanical process of division. Now, he could only sit and watch as Leo's confusion deepened into something approaching despair. "Well," Daniel began, his voice carefully steady, "let's think about it differently. When you borrow from the tens place, you're basically trading 1 10 for 10 ones, right? So if you have 47 and you need to subtract 9, you can't take 9 from 7, so you—" "I know that part," Leo interrupted, his voice tight with frustration. "But I can't see how it works. I need to see the numbers." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Leo was a visual learner, had always been a visual learner. He needed to see problems worked out step by step, needed the kinesthetic reinforcement of watching someone else's hand move across the paper before he could internalize the process. All of Daniel's verbal explanations, no matter how clear, were like trying to teach someone to swim while standing on the shore. That night, after Leo had gone to bed with his homework still unfinished, Daniel sat alone in his living room, staring at the pencil that lay on the coffee table. It was an ordinary wooden pencil, yellow paint worn smooth from use, the kind of unremarkable tool that had been part of his daily existence for so long, he'd never truly seen it. Now it represented everything he'd lost, the ability to write, to draw, to show, rather than simply tell. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the pencil with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Slowly, carefully, he extended his right leg toward the coffee table. The motion felt foreign, awkward, like trying to use a limb that had never been designed for precision work. His foot, still in its sock, nudged the pencil, sending it rolling toward the table's edge. "Shit," he muttered, then glanced toward Leo's bedroom, relieved to see the door still closed. Using his left foot to steady the pencil against the table's surface, Daniel attempted to grip it between his toes. The first few tries were hopeless. His toes, accustomed to nothing more complex than walking and balancing, fumbled with the unfamiliar task. The pencil slipped repeatedly, clattering to the floor each time with a small sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet house. After 20 minutes of failed attempts, Daniel managed to achieve something resembling a grip. The pencil sat precariously between his big toe and second toe, held in place by pressure that felt both insufficient and uncomfortable. He positioned a piece of paper on the coffee table and attempted to make a mark. The result was a jagged line that looked more like the work of a seismograph than a human hand. The angle was wrong, the pressure impossible to control, and the pencil kept slipping from his unsteady grip. But it was a line, proof that the concept wasn't entirely impossible. Over the following days, Daniel began a secret regimen of practice. While Leo was at school and Sophia was at her own job, he would position himself on the living room floor, surrounded by scattered sheets of paper, working with the desperate intensity of a man trying to reinvent himself from the ground up. He practiced holding the pencil, finding the optimal position between his toes, learning to compensate for the lack of fine motor control with deliberate, careful movements. The process was humiliating. His early attempts at writing his own name looked like the work of a small child, each letter a mountain to climb, each word an exercise in frustration. His back ached from the awkward positioning required to bring his foot close enough to the paper. His leg muscles, unaccustomed to such precise work, cramped and protested. More than once he swept the papers away in anger, convinced that he was pursuing an impossible dream. But gradually, incrementally, improvement came. The lines grew steadier. The letters began to resemble actual letters. After 2 weeks of secret practice, Daniel managed to write Leo in shaky but recognizable script. He stared at those 3 letters for nearly an hour, tears streaming down his face. Not from frustration this time, but from the first genuine hope he'd felt since the accident. It was Maya who discovered his clandestine efforts. She arrived for a routine checkup on a Tuesday afternoon and found Daniel on the floor, a pencil gripped between his toes, working on a series of number exercises. "Well," she said, settling down beside him without ceremony, "this is interesting." Daniel flushed with embarrassment, dropping the pencil and attempting to gather the scattered papers. "It's nothing. You were just proving that I was right about how stubborn you are," Maya interrupted, examining one of his practice sheets with professional interest. "How long have you been working on this?" "About 3 weeks. And you didn't think to mention it during our sessions?" Daniel shrugged, suddenly feeling like a child caught in mischief. "I didn't know if it would work. I didn't want to get anyone's hopes up." Maya studied the progression of his work, noting the clear improvement from the earliest, shakiest attempts to the more recent, controlled efforts. "Your son," she said finally, "is going to lose his mind when he sees this. You think he'll be proud?" "I think," Maya replied, settling cross-legged on the floor and handing him the pencil, "that he's going to realize his father is the most determined man in Brookhaven. Show me how you hold it." They worked together for the remainder of the afternoon, Maya offering suggestions for grip and positioning while Daniel demonstrated the techniques he'd developed through trial and error. By the time Leo returned from school, Daniel had filled several pages with numbers in simple words, his footwriting neat enough to be clearly legible. "Dad?" Leo's voice came from the kitchen, followed by the familiar sound of his backpack hitting the floor. "I'm home. I've got more math homework." Daniel looked at Maya, who nodded encouragingly. "I think," she whispered, "it's time to stop keeping secrets." "Leo," Daniel called, his voice steady with newfound confidence. "Come in here. I want to show you something." As his son's footsteps approached the living room, Daniel positioned the pencil between his toes and wrote, in careful, deliberate letters, "I can help you with your homework now." The moment when Leo saw those words, when understanding dawned in his young face, followed by amazement, followed by the kind of joy that comes from witnessing the impossible, would remain with Daniel for the rest of his life. It was the moment he stopped being a victim of his circumstances and became, once again, a father who could solve problems, who could help, who could teach his son that sometimes the most important victories are the ones nobody sees coming. The November evenings in Brookhaven arrived early and stayed late, wrapping the small industrial town in a blanket of premature darkness that made the warm glow from house windows seem especially precious. In the Reyes home, the living room had been transformed into something that resembled both a classroom and a rehabilitation center, with papers scattered across the coffee table, pencils arranged within easy reach of Daniel's feet, and the persistent smell of eraser shavings that marked serious academic work. For 2 weeks now, Daniel had been conducting what he privately called his Midnight University intensive training sessions that began after Leo went to bed and stretched well past any reasonable bedtime. The living room carpet bore the evidence of his efforts, small indentations where his knees had pressed against the floor, pencil marks on the hardwood where his early attempts had missed their target entirely, and a growing collection of practice papers that documented his painstaking progress, from illegible scratches to something approaching actual handwriting. Tonight felt different. Tonight, Daniel sensed he was on the verge of something significant. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He positioned himself on the floor with the methodical precision of a craftsman preparing for intricate work. His right foot, now surprisingly nimble after countless hours of practice, gripped a freshly sharpened pencil between his big toe and second toe. The grip, which had once felt foreign and impossible, now seemed almost natural. Not comfortable exactly, but familiar in the way that any hard-won skill eventually becomes an extension of one's body. The paper before him was blank, except for a single word written in Leo's careful third-grade handwriting: mathematics. Below it, Leo had copied the day's homework assignment, a series of two-digit multiplication problems that had left him frustrated and close to tears during dinner. Mrs. Jennings had introduced the concept the week before, but the leap from simple addition to the more complex relationships of multiplication was proving challenging for many students in the class. Daniel studied the first problem, 23 times 14. In his mind, he could see exactly how to break it down, how to demonstrate the process visually in a way that would make sense to Leo's learning style. The challenge was translating that mental clarity into physical action using body parts that had never been designed for such precision work. He began with the setup, carefully drawing a simple grid to organize the partial products. His foot moved deliberately across the paper, each line requiring conscious thought and steady pressure. The first few marks were tentative, but as he found his rhythm, the movements became more fluid. He wrote 23 at the top of the grid, then 14 to the side. His numbers now clear enough that even Mrs. Jennings would have no trouble reading them. The multiplication itself required even greater precision. Daniel worked through the problem step by step, showing how 23 times 4 equals 92, then how 23 times 10 equals 230, then how adding those partial products gives the final answer of 322. Each number, each mathematical symbol, each explanatory arrow was a small victory, proof that his brain's understanding could still flow through his body to create something useful, something that could help his son. As he worked through the second problem, then the third, Daniel felt something shift inside him. The familiar satisfaction of craftsmanship was returning, that deep pleasure that comes from taking raw materials, in this case, his own determination and a simple pencil, and creating something both functional and beautiful. The mathematical explanations laid out on the paper weren't just homework help. They were love made visible, father care translated into a form that Leo could understand and use. By midnight, Daniel had completed detailed solutions to all 12 problems, each one accompanied by clear, step-by-step explanations and visual aids that would help Leo understand not just the answers, but the underlying logic. His back ached from the awkward positioning, and his toes were stiff from the unaccustomed work, but the satisfaction was immense. He had reclaimed something essential, not just the ability to help with homework, but his role as the person Leo turned to when the world seemed too complex to navigate alone. The real test came the next evening when Leo returned from school with a new assignment and the familiar look of mathematical dread clouding his young face. Daniel waited until after dinner, then casually suggested they work on homework together in the living room. "But Dad," Leo said, settling onto the couch with his backpack, "you can't. How can you?" "Trust me," Daniel replied, positioning himself on the floor and reaching for a pencil with his foot. "I've been practicing something." Leo's eyes widened as he watched his father grip the pencil with unmistakable competence and begin writing numbers on a fresh sheet of paper. The movements were deliberate and careful, but they were also confident, the motions of someone who had mastered a difficult skill through patient repetition. "Whoa!" Leo breathed, sliding down from the couch to sit cross-legged on the floor beside his father. "How did you learn to do that?" "The same way you're going to learn multiplication," Daniel replied, working through the first problem with clear, steady strokes. "Practice, practice, and more practice. But the secret is, once you understand how something works, your brain can find new ways to make it happen." They worked together for nearly an hour, Leo's confusion gradually giving way to understanding as Daniel's foot-written explanations made the abstract concepts concrete and manageable. When Leo successfully solved a problem on his own, using the visual method Daniel had demonstrated, the boy's whoop of joy was so loud that Sophia knocked on the door to make sure everyone was all right. "Dad," Leo said as they cleaned up the papers, his voice quiet with something approaching awe, "you're like a superhero. Nobody else's dad can write with their feet." Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. For months, he had seen himself as diminished, as less than what he had been before the accident. But in Leo's eyes, he wasn't broken or limited. He was extraordinary. He had taken a devastating loss and transformed it into something that made him not weaker, but uniquely strong. "Leo," he said, carefully setting the pencil aside, "we all have superpowers. Sometimes we just have to figure out new ways to use them." As his son headed to bed, homework completed and confidence restored, Daniel remained on the living room floor, surrounded by the evidence of their shared triumph. The papers covered with foot-written mathematics weren't just homework solutions. They were proof that love could overcome any obstacle, that determination could transform limitation into innovation, and that sometimes the most important victories happen not in public arenas but in quiet living rooms, where fathers and sons refuse to give up on each other. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new homework assignments, new opportunities to prove that strength isn't measured by what you've lost, but by what you're willing to fight to keep. Tonight, Daniel Reyes, craftsman, father, and newly discovered foot-writing mathematician, went to sleep knowing that he had found his way back to being the hero his son needed him to be. The early December snow fell softly outside the kitchen window as Daniel and Leo sat at their usual homework station, now expanded to accommodate Daniel's unique teaching style. What had once been a simple kitchen table setup had evolved into something resembling a specialized learning laboratory, with papers organized within easy reach of Daniel's feet, extra pencils arranged in a makeshift holder fashioned from an empty coffee can, and a small cushion that Sophia had sewn to make Daniel's floor position more comfortable during their longer study sessions. 3 weeks had passed since that first breakthrough evening, and their nightly homework routine had become the highlight of both their days. Leo would return from school with the eager anticipation of a child who knew he had a secret weapon waiting at home, while Daniel spent his afternoons mentally preparing lesson plans that would challenge his son while building his confidence. Tonight's assignment was fractions, a concept that had historically been Leo's mathematical nemesis. Mrs. Jennings had sent home a note explaining that the class was struggling with the abstract nature of parts and wholes, and several parents had requested additional practice materials. Daniel smiled as he read the note, remembering his own childhood confusion with fractions and the patient way his father had used pie slices and pizza pieces to make the concept tangible. "Okay, buddy," Daniel said, settling into position on the floor with a fresh sheet of paper. "Let's talk about fractions, but first, tell me what you know about pizza." Leo's face brightened immediately. "Pizza is awesome, and it comes in triangular pieces." "Exactly. Now, if we order a pizza, and it gets cut into 8 pieces, and you eat 3 pieces, what fraction of the pizza did you eat?" Leo considered this carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. 3/8? Perfect! Daniel's foot moved across the paper, drawing a circle and dividing it into 8 equal sections. His artistic skills, honed through years of woodworking design, translated surprisingly well to foot drawing. He shaded 3 of the sections with careful cross-hatching. 3/8. Now, what if I told you that 3/8 is the same amount as 6/16? That doesn't make sense, Leo protested. 3 is smaller than 6. Daniel grinned and drew another circle, this one divided into 16 pieces. He carefully shaded 6 of them, making sure Leo could see that the total shaded area was identical to the first circle. See? Same amount of pizza, just cut into smaller pieces. The revelation that dawned on Leo's face was beautiful to witness. Oh, so the number on top is how many pieces you have, and the number on bottom is how many pieces the whole thing got cut into. You've got it. The top number is the numerator. That's how many parts you're talking about. The bottom number is the denominator. That's how many equal parts the whole thing is divided into. They worked through problem after problem, Daniel's foot moving with increasing confidence across the paper, as he drew visual representations of fractions, showed equivalent fractions using different sized circles, and even demonstrated simple addition and subtraction using pie charts that looked remarkably professional for being drawn by toes. What struck Daniel most profoundly during these sessions wasn't just Leo's growing mathematical confidence, but the restoration of their relationship. The accident had created an emotional distance between them, not from lack of love, but from Daniel's own shame and Leo's uncertainty about how to relate to his changed father. These homework sessions were rebuilding that bridge, creating new, shared experiences that proved their bond was stronger than any physical limitation. "Dad," Leo said during a break between fractions problems, "Tommy Martinez's dad came to our school today for career day." Daniel's pencil paused mid-stroke. Tommy Martinez, the man whose life he'd saved in the factory accident. They'd exchanged a few brief conversations during Daniel's hospital stay. But Daniel had deliberately avoided deeper contact, partly from his own shame, and partly from not wanting to burden Tommy with guilt over the sacrifice Daniel had made. "What did he talk about?" Daniel asked carefully. "He's a mechanic now. He opened his own shop downtown. And Dad," Leo's voice grew serious, "he told our whole class about what happened at the factory, about how you saved his life." Daniel felt his chest tighten. "Leo, you don't need to. He said you're a hero. He said that because of what you did, he gets to tuck his daughter into bed every night. And he said—" Leo paused, seeming to gather courage for his next words. "He said that real heroes aren't the ones who don't get hurt. Real heroes are the ones who get hurt saving other people and then find new ways to be amazing." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Daniel had spent so much time focusing on what he'd lost that he'd forgotten to consider what he'd given. Not just to Tommy, but to Tommy's family. To his daughter who still had her father, because Daniel had been willing to risk everything for a coworker's safety. "You know what the best part is?" Leo continued, sliding down from his chair to sit beside his father on the floor. "All the other kids were impressed that their dads are policemen and firefighters and stuff. But I gotta tell them that my dad is the guy who saves people and can write with his feet. Nobody else's dad can do that." Daniel felt tears gathering in his eyes. For months he'd been terrified that Leo would be ashamed of him, that having a disabled father would somehow diminish his son's standing among his peers. Instead, Leo wore his father's unique abilities like a badge of honor. "Plus," Leo added with a grin, "I'm the only kid in my class who actually understands fractions now. Jessica Morrison still thinks 1/2 is bigger than 3/4 because the numbers are smaller." They both laughed at that, and Daniel realized that this moment, sitting on their kitchen floor, surrounded by math papers covered in foot-written equations, sharing the easy intimacy of a father and son who had found their way back to each other, was perfect in ways he never could have imagined before the accident. "The action's on, Leo," Daniel said, reaching out with his arm to pull his son closer. "You know I love you, right? And that no matter what happens, we're going to figure everything out together?" "I know, Dad, and I love you too, even if you do draw really weird-looking circles." Daniel laughed and looked down at his latest fraction diagram, which did indeed feature a circle that looked more like a lopsided oval. "Hey, they're perfectly good circles. They're just, artistically interpreted." "Is that what we're calling it?" "That's what we're calling it." As they returned to their homework, Daniel felt a peace settle over him that he hadn't experienced since before the accident. He was still disabled, still facing challenges that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago. But he was also still a father, still a teacher, still a man capable of giving his son what he needed most. Not perfect handwriting or conventional abilities, but unwavering love, and the determination to find new ways to show it. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Brookhaven in pristine white. Inside, a father and son worked side by side, proving that some bonds are strong enough to transform any obstacle into just another problem to solve together. The fluorescent lights in Clara Jennings' classroom buzzed with the same monotonous hum that had driven 3 generations of Brookhaven elementary students to distraction during particularly tedious lessons. Daniel sat in one of the tiny plastic chairs designed for 3rd graders, his knees nearly touching his chin, waiting for the parent-teacher conference that Leo's teacher had requested with unusual urgency. The chair was uncomfortable, but not nearly as uncomfortable as the weight of uncertainty that had settled in his stomach since receiving Clara's phone call. "Mr. Reyes, thank you for coming in," Clara said, entering the classroom with a stack of folders and the kind of measured smile that teachers reserve for difficult conversations. At 52, she had the weathered competence of an educator who had seen every possible family situation, every conceivable learning challenge, and every variety of parental denial. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her cardigan bore the subtle stains that marked someone who spent her days in close contact with children and their various creative expressions. "Of course," Daniel replied, struggling slightly to find a comfortable position in the miniature furniture. "Is Leo in some kind of trouble?" Clara settled into her own chair, mercifully adult-sized, and opened the top folder. "Not trouble, exactly, but I am concerned about his academic progress. Leo is a bright boy, Mr. Reyes, but he's been struggling with several key concepts this semester. His test scores have been inconsistent, and I worry that he's not getting the support he needs at home." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Leo's homework sessions had become the cornerstone of his new identity as a father, the proof that he could still provide what his son needed most. The idea that his efforts might be inadequate, or worse, counterproductive, threatened to undermine everything he'd rebuilt since the accident. "I don't understand," Daniel said carefully. "We work on his homework together every night. His fractions test last week, he told me he got a B+. "He did," Clara acknowledged, consulting her notes, "and that was an improvement. But, Mr. Reyes, I have to ask, are you really able to provide the kind of hands-on guidance that Leo needs? I know about your accident, and I admire your determination. But some children require very specific types of support." The delicate phrasing couldn't disguise the underlying assumption that a man without hands couldn't possibly offer meaningful academic assistance to his child. Daniel felt his face flush with a combination of anger and shame, the old familiar sensation of being judged insufficient because of his disability. "What kind of support are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Clara leaned forward with the earnest expression of someone delivering unwelcome but necessary news. "The district has excellent tutoring resources. There's a learning center downtown that specializes in elementary math and reading comprehension. And if cost is a concern, there are scholarship programs available for families facing unusual circumstances." Unusual circumstances. Daniel repeated the phrase slowly, tasting its bitter implications. "You mean families with disabled parents?" "I mean families where children might benefit from additional academic support," Clara corrected, but her slight flush suggested that Daniel's interpretation wasn't entirely off base. "Leo is a wonderful boy, Mr. Reyes, but he deserves every opportunity to succeed. Sometimes that means acknowledging when professional intervention might be helpful." The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the classroom door. Marcus Hale entered without waiting for permission, his presence immediately filling the small space with an aura of aggressive competence. He wore his factory supervisor's uniform-like armor, pressed shirt, polished boots, and the kind of clipboard that suggested official business requiring immediate attention. "Daniel," Marcus said with forced joviality, "I thought I might find you here. Mrs. Jennings, I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I have some paperwork that Mr. Reyes needs to review." Clara looked confused but gestured toward an empty chair. "Of course, please join us." Marcus settled heavily into the plastic chair, which groaned under his weight. "I was just explaining to Daniel here about the company's disability benefits package. Very generous, really. Monthly payments, healthcare coverage, even educational assistance for dependents." He opened his clipboard and extracted several official-looking forms. "All he needs to do is sign these acknowledgement papers, and everything gets processed automatically." Daniel stared at the forms without reaching for them. "What exactly am I acknowledging?" "Standard stuff," Marcus replied with practiced casualness. "Confirmation of permanent disability status, agreement to ongoing medical evaluations, acceptance of the settlement terms. Basically just paperwork that makes everything official so you can focus on adaptation." The word, adaptation, carried the same subtle condescension that had colored Clara's suggestions about tutoring. Both of them, Daniel realized, were operating from the same fundamental assumption, that his life was now about managing limitations rather than discovering new possibilities. "And if I don't sign?" Daniel asked. Marcus's expression hardened slightly. "Well, that would complicate things. The company needs clear documentation for insurance purposes. And frankly, Daniel, I think you're being unrealistic about your situation. You can't work, you can't provide for your family the way you used to, and now Mrs. Jennings is telling us that Leo needs professional help with his schoolwork." He gestured broadly, encompassing the classroom and its implications. "Maybe it's time to accept reality and let the people who are qualified to help actually help." The room fell silent except for the buzzing fluorescent lights and the distant sound of children playing during recess. Daniel felt the weight of their combined expectations, that he would sign the papers, accept the tutoring, acknowledge his insufficiency, and retreat into the safe, diminished life that society had prepared for him. "Mrs. Jennings," Daniel said finally, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest, "when was the last time you actually looked at Leo's homework? I mean, really looked at it, not just checked whether it was completed?" Clara seemed taken aback by the question. Well, I review all the students' work, of course." "Because if you had looked, really looked, you would have noticed that Leo's math papers aren't just correct, they're exceptional. His fractions work shows conceptual understanding that goes beyond rote memorization. His word problems demonstrate logical thinking that most adults struggle with. And every single assignment includes visual aids and step-by-step explanations that are more thorough than most textbooks." Daniel stood up from the ridiculous plastic chair, his presence suddenly commanding despite his physical limitations. "You want to know who's providing that guidance? I am, with my feet, because that's what fathers do. We find ways to help our children succeed no matter what obstacles we face." Marcus cleared his throat dismissively. "Daniel, be reasonable. You can't possibly—" "I can't possibly what?" Daniel's voice rose slightly, drawing concerned glances from the hallway. "I can't possibly love my son enough to learn new skills. I can't possibly adapt to challenges. I can't possibly be a better father now than I was before, precisely because I've learned what really matters." He turned to Clara, his expression intense but controlled. "Mrs. Jennings, I invite you to look at Leo's homework tomorrow night. Really look at it, and then tell me whether he needs professional tutoring or whether he needs teachers who recognize excellence even when it comes from unexpected sources." Without waiting for a response, Daniel walked toward the door, leaving Marcus's unsigned paperwork scattered on the tiny table. "Leo and I have fractions to practice. We're working on mixed numbers now. They're surprisingly complex, but we'll figure them out. We always do." As he left Clara Jennings' classroom, Daniel felt something shift inside him, not just anger at their assumptions, but a crystalline clarity about his own worth and capabilities. Society might see him as diminished, as someone to be managed and contained and provided for. But Leo saw him as a hero who could write with his feet. And increasingly, Daniel was beginning to believe that Leo's perspective was the only one that truly mattered. The real test, he knew, would come when the wider community learned about his unconventional teaching methods. But tonight he had homework to help with, and a son to prove wrong anyone who thought that love and determination weren't enough to overcome any obstacle life could present. The January thaw had turned Brookhaven's streets into a maze of slush and possibility, and inside the Reyes home, winter had given way to something resembling a renaissance. What had begun as simple homework assistance had evolved into something far more ambitious and creative. Daniel's living room now looked like the workshop of a mad scientist crossed with an art studio. Papers covered in foot-drawn diagrams scattered across every surface, colored pencils organized by hue in repurposed coffee cans, and a growing collection of Leo's projects that showcased increasingly sophisticated collaborative work. Tonight's challenge was Leo's science fair project on the solar system, assignment that required not just research and writing but visual presentation skills that would test the limits of Daniel's newfound artistic abilities. Mrs. Jennings had announced the project with her usual enthusiasm for hands-on learning, apparently unaware that one of her students would be receiving guidance from possibly the only father in Brookhaven who could create detailed astronomical diagrams using only his toes. "Okay, Dad," Leo said, settling cross-legged on the floor with a stack of library books about planets and stars. "Mrs. Jennings says we need to show the relative sizes of all the planets and explain why Jupiter is so much bigger than Earth." Daniel studied the reference materials Leo had gathered, his mind already working through the visual challenges of representing planetary proportions accurately. His woodworking background had taught him to think in terms of scale and spatial relationships, skills that translated surprisingly well to educational illustration. "First things first," Daniel said, positioning a large sheet of poster board on the floor, "we need to figure out how to make this make sense. If Earth is the size of a marble, Jupiter would be the size of a basketball. But we can't fit a real basketball on poster board." "So we make everything smaller but keep the proportions right?" Leo asked, demonstrating the kind of logical thinking that made Daniel's chest swell with pride. "Exactly, you're thinking like an engineer." Daniel gripped a pencil between his toes and began sketching, his movements now fluid and confident after months of practice. He drew a series of circles representing the planets, starting with tiny Mercury and working his way out to massive Jupiter. Each circle was carefully proportioned, labeled with neat foot-written text that would have been legible to anyone who didn't know its unconventional origin. But the real innovation came when Daniel began adding visual elements that went beyond simple representation. Using colored pencils, he created cross-sectional diagrams showing planetary composition, illustrated the concept of orbital distance with curved lines that swept across the poster in elegant arcs, and even sketched a small diagram showing how Jupiter's gravity affects its moons. "Whoa," Leo breathed, watching his father work. "That's way better than anything in our textbook. How did you know to draw it like that?" "Same way I knew how to cut wood," Daniel replied, adding shading to Saturn's rings with delicate cross-hatching strokes. "You have to understand how things fit together, how the parts relate to the whole. Jupiter isn't just big. It's big for specific reasons that affect everything around it." As they worked together through the evening, Leo taking notes while Daniel illustrated concepts with increasing creativity, something remarkable happened. Leo began asking questions that went beyond his original assignment. Questions about black holes and supernovas, about the possibility of life on other planets, about whether humans would ever travel to Jupiter's moons. Daniel found himself researching answers, sketching speculative diagrams, turning a simple school project into an exploration that engaged both their imaginations. "You know what, Dad?" Leo said as they put the finishing touches on their solar system poster. "I bet none of the other kids are going to have anything like this." Tommy Chen's dad is an actual scientist, but he just helps Tommy copy stuff from the internet. You're like making this stuff come alive." The comment struck Daniel profoundly because it highlighted something he'd been gradually realizing. His disability hadn't just forced him to find new ways to help Leo, it had made him a better teacher. Without the ability to simply do things for his son, Daniel had been forced to break down complex concepts, to find visual representations, to engage Leo's mind rather than just his compliance. The constraint had created innovation. Word of Leo's exceptional project work had begun to spread through the informal network of parent communication that keeps small-town schools humming. Sofia Ramirez mentioned to her sister that Daniel was helping Leo with homework in the most amazing way. The sister mentioned it to her friend at the grocery store. The friend mentioned it to her husband, who worked with Tommy Martinez at his new automotive shop. The chain of communication eventually reached Clara Jennings, who made a point of examining Leo's recent assignments with new attention. What she found surprised her. Not just completion, but excellence. Leo's math papers showed work that was more thorough than her answer key. His science diagrams were more detailed and accurate than the textbook illustrations. His book reports included analytical thinking that belonged in middle school curricula. More telling still was Leo's transformation in class. The boy who had struggled with confidence was now raising his hand to answer complex questions, explaining mathematical concepts to classmates who were confused, and approaching new challenges with the kind of intellectual fearlessness that marked natural learners. He spoke about his homework with genuine enthusiasm, describing the cool diagrams his father drew and the awesome way complex problems could be broken down into manageable pieces. Clara found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to reconsider her assumptions. She had recommended tutoring for a child who was receiving instruction that exceeded anything the district's learning center could provide. She had questioned the capabilities of a father who was proving to be more innovative and effective than many credentialed educators. The turning point came during a faculty meeting when Clara shared Leo's solar system project with her colleagues. The poster was passed around the conference room, generating comments that ranged from impressed to astonished. The principal, Dr. Sarah Martinez, studied the detailed planetary diagrams with particular interest. "This is exceptional work," Dr. Martinez said finally. "The visual representations are more sophisticated than anything in our approved curriculum materials. Which tutor is working with Leo?" "That's just it," Clara replied, her voice carrying a note of bewilderment. "He's not working with a tutor. His father has been helping him at home." "The father who lost his arms in the factory accident?" asked Jim Hendricks, the fourth-grade teacher who coached Little League and knew most of the local families. "Yes, and apparently he's been doing all of this instruction using adaptive techniques that are, well, frankly, they're remarkable." Dr. Martinez set the poster aside and fixed Clara with the kind of direct look that principals reserve for moments of administrative clarity. It sounds like we may have misjudged the situation. Perhaps instead of recommending outside intervention, we should be asking Mr. Reyes if he'd be willing to share his methods with other parents. The suggestion hung in the air like a revolutionary idea, which in many ways it was. The notion that a disabled parent might have something to teach the educational establishment, rather than something to learn from it, challenged fundamental assumptions about expertise, capability, and the nature of effective instruction. As Clara walked to her car that evening, Leo's solar system poster tucked carefully under her arm for safekeeping. Until the science fair, she found herself wondering how many other exceptional parents she had overlooked, simply because their methods didn't match her expectations. Daniel Reyes had forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most effective teaching comes not from formal training, but from love, combined with the determination to find whatever methods actually work. Tomorrow, she would need to make some phone calls, not to tutoring services, but to apologize to a father who had proven that the most important qualification for helping children learn isn't having hands, but having heart. The Brookhaven Elementary School Science Fair arrived on a crisp February morning, with all the nervous energy and parental anxiety that such events inevitably generate. The gymnasium had been transformed into a maze of poster boards and demonstration tables, where third graders stood beside projects ranging from the ambitious to the adorably incorrect, while parents hovered nearby with cameras and barely concealed competitive instincts. Daniel arrived with Leo at precisely 9 o'clock, their solar system poster carefully protected in a presentation folder that Sophia had helped them construct. Leo wore his best shirt, and the kind of confident smile that comes from knowing your project represents genuine understanding rather than adult-supervised copying. Daniel, dressed in his cleanest jeans and a button-down shirt that Maya had helped him select, felt the familiar mixture of pride and apprehension that had become his constant companion since learning to navigate the world as a disabled father. Their assigned table was in the center of the gymnasium, a position that would ensure maximum visibility for both admirers and critics. As they set up their display, Daniel noticed other parents glancing in their direction, with expressions that ranged from curious to sympathetic to openly skeptical. Word had clearly spread about Leo's exceptional project work and its unconventional origins. "Dad," Leo whispered as they arranged their materials, "Mrs. Patterson from down the street keeps staring at us." "Let her stare," Daniel replied, using his chin to nudge their poster into perfect alignment. "We've got nothing to hide and everything to be proud of." The morning proceeded smoothly at first. Leo demonstrated remarkable poise as he explained planetary composition and orbital mechanics to visiting parents and teachers, his understanding clearly genuine rather than memorized. Daniel stood beside him, occasionally offering supplementary information when questions went beyond third-grade curriculum, his presence both supportive and deliberately unobtrusive. It was just before lunch when Marcus Hale arrived. The factory's supervisor appeared in the gymnasium doorway like a storm cloud, his presence immediately altering the atmospheric pressure of the event. He wore his weekend casual clothes, pressed khakis and a polo shirt, but carried himself with the same aggressive authority that made factory workers step aside in the corridors of Brookhaven Manufacturing. His eyes scanned the room until they found Daniel and Leo. Then he approached with the purposeful stride of someone prepared for confrontation. "Well, well," Marcus said loudly enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "Look what we have here. Daniel Reyes, the miracle worker." Several parents turned to watch, sensing drama in the making. Leo moved instinctively closer to his father, his confidence wavering in the face of Marcus's hostile energy. "Marcus," Daniel replied evenly, "I didn't expect to see you at a school science fair." "Oh, I wouldn't miss this for the world," Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the gymnasium with practiced projection. "I had to see for myself how a man with no hands was supposedly helping his kid with homework. Quite the talk of the town, you know." Clara Jennings, who had been circulating among the displays with the principal, noticed the commotion and began moving in their direction. Other parents were now openly watching, their conversations dying as they sensed conflict brewing. Marcus gestured broadly at Leo's poster, his expression a mixture of condescension and calculated skepticism. "Very impressive display, I have to say. Professional quality work. Makes me wonder, though, how exactly did you manage to create something this sophisticated? I mean, let's be honest about your limitations." The word, limitations, hung in the air like an accusation. Daniel felt the familiar flush of anger rising in his chest, but also something new, a steady confidence born from months of proving his capabilities to the one person whose opinion truly mattered. "Why don't you ask Leo?" Daniel suggested, his voice calm despite the tension crackling around them. "He can explain exactly how we work together." Leo straightened his shoulders and looked directly at Marcus with the kind of fearless honesty that only children possess. "My dad draws all the diagrams with his feet. He taught himself how to write with his toes so he could help me with homework. He's the best teacher I've ever had." "Your dad draws with his feet," Marcus repeated, his tone suggesting this was somehow either impossible or inappropriate. "And you think that's normal?" "I think that's amazing," Leo replied, his voice growing stronger. "None of the other kids' parents can draw with their feet. My dad is special." Marcus's expression hardened. "Leo, your father is disabled. There's no shame in that, but there's also no need to pretend it's something magical. He can't work, he can't provide for your family the way he used to, and frankly, he can't give you the kind of educational support you deserve. This whole performance is just making it harder for people to help you in realistic ways." The gymnasium fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. Parents and teachers formed an unconscious circle around the confrontation, their faces reflecting a mixture of discomfort and fascination. Daniel felt the weight of their collective attention, the judgment implicit in their stares. It was Leo who broke the silence. "You're wrong," the 9-year-old said, his voice clear and strong in the hushed space. "My dad doesn't just help me with homework, he makes me understand things. Before the accident, he used to just do my math for me when I got frustrated. Now he shows me how to figure it out myself. He makes me think, instead of just copying." Leo moved to stand directly in front of his father, facing Marcus with remarkable composure. "And you know what else? My dad saved Tommy Martinez's life. Tommy's daughter Emma is in my class, and she gets to have a dad because mine was brave enough to help, even when it meant getting hurt. That doesn't sound disabled to me. That sounds like a hero." The words carried across the gymnasium with devastating effectiveness. Several parents nodded in recognition. Tommy Martinez's story was well known in Brookhaven, though many had never connected it directly to Daniel. Others looked ashamed of their own assumptions, their faces reflecting the discomfort that comes from having prejudices exposed in public. Clara Jennings chose that moment to step forward, her teacher's authority cutting through the tension. "Mr. Hale, I think you should see something." She moved to Leo's poster and pointed to the detailed planetary diagrams. "This work represents understanding at a level that exceeds our grade-level expectations. Leo's recent academic performance has been exceptional, and it's directly attributable to the innovative instruction he's receiving at home." She turned to address the crowd of parents and teachers that had gathered. "I owe Mr. Reyes an apology. I had concerns about Leo's academic support, and I was wrong. What this family has accomplished together is remarkable, and frankly, it's put some of our traditional methods to shame." Dr. Martinez, the principal, stepped up beside Clara. "In fact, we've been discussing the possibility of asking Mr. Reyes to conduct a workshop for other parents about alternative teaching methods. His approaches to visual learning and conceptual breakdown are exactly what many of our students need." Marcus looked around the gymnasium, perhaps realizing that the tide of opinion had turned decisively against him. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "You're all encouraging delusions. Daniel, you need to face reality and accept help instead of putting on this sideshow act." The accusation of being a sideshow act was perhaps the worst thing Marcus could have said. It reduced Daniel's hard-won skills, his dedication to his son, and his refusal to accept limitation to the level of carnival entertainment. The insult was so crude, so dismissive of everything Daniel had accomplished, that it shocked even the most skeptical observers. Daniel felt something crystallize inside him, not anger this time, but absolute clarity about his own worth and place in the world. He looked around the gymnasium at the faces watching him, saw Leo's fierce loyalty, Clara's newfound respect, and the growing recognition in other parents' eyes that they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Marcus," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the silent space, "you're right about one thing. I am putting on a show. Every day I show my son that love is stronger than limitation. I show him that determination can overcome any obstacle. I show him that real strength isn't measured by what you can hold in your hands, but by what you refuse to let go of. He gestured toward the poster with his arm. This isn't a sideshow, Marcus. This is a father refusing to let his son's dreams be smaller because of other people's expectations. And if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should ask yourself why. The confrontation was over, though Marcus seemed slow to realize it. He looked around the gymnasium one more time, perhaps hoping to find support that wasn't there, then turned and walked toward the exit without another word. The crowd of parents and teachers began to disperse, many stopping to examine Leo's project more closely and to offer Daniel words of admiration and respect. As the morning continued, Daniel felt something shift in his relationship not just with the school community, but with his own sense of identity. He was no longer the broken man trying to prove he could still function. He was the innovative father who had found extraordinary ways to serve his son's needs. The difference was subtle but profound, and it would change everything that came after. The week following the science fair brought an unexpected consequence that Daniel hadn't anticipated: attention. Word of the confrontation with Marcus Hale had spread through Brookhaven's interconnected social networks with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. But the story had evolved in the telling, accumulating layers of interpretation and judgment that made Daniel increasingly uncomfortable with his newfound notoriety. Some parents approached him with genuine admiration, asking detailed questions about his teaching methods and expressing interest in learning adaptive techniques for their own children. Mrs. Rodriguez, from Leo's baseball team, asked if Daniel might help her daughter with geometry, explaining that traditional tutoring hadn't worked, and she was intrigued by his visual approach to mathematical concepts. But others whispered among themselves with the kind of concerned voices that adults use when they believe children are being set up for disappointment. Daniel overheard fragments of conversations at the grocery store, in the bank parking lot, outside church after Sunday service. Conversations that questioned whether his methods were sustainable, whether Leo was truly learning or just being enabled, whether it was fair to raise a child's expectations when reality might prove so much harsher. The doubt reached its crescendo on a Thursday evening when Daniel answered a knock at his door to find Janet Morrison, the PTA president and one of Brookhaven's most influential community voices. She stood on his porch with the kind of serious expression that suggested official business, holding a manila folder that undoubtedly contained formal documentation of whatever concerns had brought her to his home. "Mr. Reyes," she began without preamble, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but we need to discuss Leo's situation." Daniel invited her inside, settling into his usual spot on the living room floor, while she chose the couch with careful deliberation. The coffee table between them was covered with that evening's homework materials. Leo was upstairs finishing a book report, and Daniel noticed Janet's eyes scanning the adaptive equipment and foot-written practice sheets with professional assessment. "There's been considerable discussion," Janet continued, opening her folder to reveal several printed documents, "about the methods you've been using to assist Leo with his schoolwork. While everyone admires your dedication, there are concerns about whether these approaches are truly in Leo's best interests." "What kind of concerns?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Well, for one thing, there's the question of sustainability. You've developed some impressive adaptive skills, Mr. Reyes. But what happens when Leo's curriculum becomes more demanding? High school mathematics, science labs that require manual dexterity, college preparation courses that assume traditional study methods?" Janet's voice carried the weight of someone who had clearly given this considerable thought. "Are we doing Leo a disservice by allowing him to become dependent on instructional methods that won't be available to him as he advances academically?" The questions hit Daniel like physical blows because they echoed his own deepest fears, that his limitations would eventually become Leo's limitations, that his determination to remain involved in his son's education might actually handicap the boy's future opportunities. "And then there's the social aspect," Janet continued relentlessly. "Leo is becoming known as the boy whose father helps him with homework in unusual ways. Children can be cruel about differences, Mr. Reyes. Are we certain that this attention is beneficial for his social development?" Daniel felt the familiar weight of shame settling over him, the old conviction that his disability made him a burden rather than an asset to his son's life. Perhaps Marcus Hale had been right. Perhaps his stubborn refusal to accept his limitations was indeed harming the person he loved most. "What are you suggesting?" he asked quietly. Janet leaned forward with the earnest expression of someone delivering difficult but necessary medicine. The district has agreed to provide Leo with exceptional tutoring support, one-on-one instruction with certified specialists, access to learning technologies that could supplement his natural abilities, even preparation for advanced placement programs when he reaches high school. All at no cost to your family given your circumstances. The phrase, given your circumstances, carried the full weight of pity and charitable concern. Daniel was being offered help not because Leo needed it, but because his father was inadequate to provide what any normal child should expect. The only requirement, Janet continued, is that Leo's primary academic support comes from qualified professionals rather than improvised methods. You'd still be involved, of course, but in a more appropriate capacity. The conversation was interrupted by footsteps on the stairs as Leo bounded down to the living room, his completed book report in hand and his face bright with the excitement of a child eager to share his accomplishments. "Dad, I finished the report on Bridge to Terabithia, and I think I figured out how to explain why Jess was angry at Leslie. Can we draw one of those emotion maps like we did for the last book?" Leo stopped short when he noticed Janet Morrison sitting in their living room, his enthusiasm dampening as he sensed the adult tension that filled the space. "Hello, Mrs. Morrison," he said politely, though his eyes sought his father's face for clues about what was happening. "Hello, Leo," Janet replied with forced brightness. "I was just talking to your father about your schoolwork. You've been doing very well this year." "Yeah, because Dad helps me understand everything. He draws these amazing diagrams that make complicated stuff make sense." Leo moved to sit beside Daniel on the floor, unconsciously aligning himself with his father against whatever adult conspiracy was unfolding. Janet cleared her throat delicately. "Leo, how would you feel about working with some special teachers who could help you with advanced subjects? Teachers who have fancy equipment and lots of experience with students who want to do really well in school?" Leo's expression grew puzzled, then suspicious. "Why would I need special teachers? I already have Dad." "Well, sometimes as schoolwork gets harder, children need different kinds of help." "Are you saying Dad can't help me anymore?" Leo's voice carried a sharp edge that surprised all three of them. "Because that's not true. Dad taught me fractions and decimals and planetary motion and how to analyze character development in stories. He's smarter than any of my teachers." Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion at his son's fierce loyalty, but also with the crushing weight of responsibility. Was he really equipped to guide Leo through increasingly complex academic challenges? Was his love enough to compensate for his limitations? "Leo," Janet said gently, "your father is very special, and everyone can see how much he loves you, but love isn't always enough. Sometimes children need help that even the most dedicated parents can't provide." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Love isn't always enough. Daniel had built his entire identity around the belief that his determination to help Leo could overcome any obstacle. But what if he was wrong? What if his son deserved better than a father who had to write with his feet? It was Leo who broke the silence, his 9-year-old voice carrying a conviction that seemed to come from somewhere far older and wiser than his years. "Mrs. Morrison," he said with perfect politeness, "I think you don't understand about my dad. He doesn't help me with homework because he has to. He helps me because he's the best teacher I've ever had. And if you try to make him stop, you'll just make me learn less, not more." Leo stood up and faced Janet with remarkable composure. "Dad, can you show Mrs. Morrison how you taught me to break down complex word problems? I think she needs to see what real teaching looks like." In that moment, Daniel realized that his son's faith in him was not misplaced charity or childish naivete. It was recognition of something real, that his adaptive methods had made him not a lesser teacher, but a more innovative one. That his love for Leo had driven him to discover approaches that worked better than traditional instruction. "Mrs. Morrison," Daniel said, rising to his feet with new confidence, "I appreciate your concern for Leo's future, but I think you're operating from a fundamental misunderstanding. I'm not a disabled man trying to help his son despite his limitations. I'm a father who has learned to teach in ways that most people never even attempt. And if you'd like to see what that looks like, I'd be happy to show you." The test of his resolve had come not from external obstacles, but from his own willingness to accept other people's definitions of his worth. Tonight, with Leo's unwavering support and his own hard-won skills, Daniel chose to reject those definitions and trust instead in what he had proven to himself and his son. That love combined with determination could indeed create possibilities that exceeded anyone's expectations. Janet Morrison left their house that evening with her folder of alternative arrangements unused, having witnessed a teaching demonstration that challenged everything she thought she knew about educational effectiveness. And Daniel went to sleep knowing that the most important test he would ever face was one he had already passed, earning his son's respect not through conventional abilities, but through the courage to find extraordinary ways to serve the people he loved. The Brookhaven Community Center had never hosted anything quite like Daniel Reyes's first adaptive learning workshop. On a warm Saturday morning in late March, the multi-purpose room that usually served for senior citizen bingo and youth basketball practice had been transformed into an unconventional classroom, where folding chairs formed a loose circle around several low tables covered with paper, pencils, and adaptive equipment that Maya Patel had helped Daniel assemble. The idea for the workshop had emerged from the aftermath of Janet Morrison's visit, when Clara Jennings approached Daniel with a proposal that surprised them both. Instead of defending traditional educational methods, she had suggested that Daniel's innovations might benefit other families struggling with learning challenges. What started as a casual conversation had evolved into an official district-sponsored event, advertised in the local paper and promoted through the school's parent network. 23 people had signed up, parents of children with various learning differences, a few teachers curious about alternative instructional methods, and several community members who had heard about Daniel's story and wanted to witness his techniques firsthand. Among the attendees was Tommy Martinez, whose daughter Emma had been struggling with reading comprehension, and surprisingly, Dr. Sarah Martinez, the school principal, who had decided that observing Daniel's methods might inform district-wide policy discussions. Daniel arrived early with Leo, both of them carrying boxes of materials that had taken weeks to prepare. Leo had insisted on helping with the workshop, arguing that he was the living proof of his father's methods, and therefore an essential part of the demonstration. Daniel had agreed, recognizing that his son's participation would provide authenticity that no amount of theoretical explanation could match. As participants filled the room, Daniel felt a familiar mixture of nervousness and determination. This was different from helping Leo with homework or defending his methods to skeptical administrators. This was stepping forward as a teacher in his own right, claiming expertise based not on formal credentials but on practical results and innovative adaptation. "Good morning, everyone," Daniel began, standing at the front of the room with Leo beside him. "I'm Daniel Reyes, and this is my son Leo. 6 months ago, I thought my teaching days were over. Today, I'd like to show you why I was wrong, and how some of the best educational tools come from necessity, creativity, and refusing to accept that there's only one way to help children learn." He settled onto the floor in front of the group, Leo arranging papers and pencils within easy reach of his feet. "The first thing I want you to understand is that adaptive teaching isn't about limitation. It's about innovation. When I lost my hands, I could have focused on everything I couldn't do anymore. Instead, I discovered methods that work better than anything I'd tried before." Daniel gripped a pencil between his toes and began drawing on a large sheet of paper positioned on the floor. His movements were smooth and confident, creating a detailed diagram of a mathematical concept as he spoke. Visual learning isn't just helpful for some children, it's essential for most children. When Leo struggled with fractions, traditional worksheets weren't enough. But when I started drawing fraction relationships, showing him how parts relate to wholes using pictures he could understand, everything clicked. Leo stepped forward with the enthusiasm of a seasoned teaching assistant. "Watch this," he said to the audience. "Dad, show them the pizza method for equivalent fractions." Over the next hour, Daniel demonstrated technique after technique, each one emerging from the necessity of finding new ways to communicate complex concepts without traditional tools. He showed how foot drawing forced him to break down problems into their essential components, how the physical challenge of gripping a pencil with his toes had taught him to slow down and ensure each mark was deliberate and meaningful. "The real breakthrough," Daniel explained while sketching a diagram of planetary motion, "came when I realized that my limitations were forcing me to be a better teacher. I couldn't just do the work for Leo, I had to help him understand it. I couldn't rush through explanations. Every word had to count. I couldn't rely on fancy materials. I had to make simple tools work extraordinarily well." Emma Martinez's mother raised her hand tentatively. "But what about children who need different kinds of support?" "Emma struggles with reading, not math." "Show them the story mapping technique, Dad," Leo suggested, and Daniel moved to a fresh sheet of paper. Reading comprehension. Daniel said, beginning to sketch character relationship diagrams with practiced ease, is fundamentally about understanding connections between characters, between events, between causes and effects. When traditional methods aren't working, sometimes you need to make those connections visible. He drew a complex web showing character relationships from a popular children's book, using different colors and line styles to represent different types of connections. The diagram was more sophisticated than anything in the school's approved curriculum materials, yet created entirely with foot-drawn techniques that any motivated parent could learn. Maya Patel, who had been observing from the back of the room, stepped forward during a break. "What Daniel is demonstrating isn't just adaptive technique," she told the group. "It's master-level educational innovation. I've worked with hundreds of families, and I've never seen anyone develop methods this effective through pure determination and love." As the workshop continued, something remarkable happened. Parents began sharing their own stories of children who struggled with traditional learning approaches. Teachers admitted that conventional methods didn't reach every student, and a sense of community formed around the shared recognition that effective education often requires creative problem-solving rather than rigid adherence to established protocols. Tommy Martinez stood up during the question period, his voice thick with emotion. "I need to say something. Daniel saved my life in that factory accident, and he lost his hands doing it. For months, I carried guilt about that, wondering if I was worth the sacrifice. Today, watching him teach, seeing what he's built with his son, I finally understand something. Daniel didn't lose his purpose in that accident. He found it." The room fell silent as Tommy continued. "My daughter is going to benefit from what Daniel discovered through his struggle. Other children are going to learn better because he refused to give up. That accident that seemed so senseless, it led to this. It led to him becoming the teacher he was meant to be." As the workshop concluded and participants gathered their materials, many stopping to schedule follow-up sessions or to exchange contact information, Daniel felt a profound sense of completion. He had traveled a path from victim to survivor to innovator, but the final destination was perhaps the most important. He had become a source of possibility for others facing their own challenges. Clara Jennings approached him as the room emptied, holding a folder that contained formal paperwork. "Daniel, the district would like to offer you a position as a consultant for adaptive learning strategies. Part-time, working with teachers and families who need specialized approaches. The pay isn't much, but it would be official recognition of your expertise." Daniel looked at the employment offer, then at Leo, who was beaming with pride. For the first time since the accident, someone was offering him work not as charity for a disabled man, but as acknowledgement of skills he had earned through dedication and innovation. "Dad," Leo said quietly, "you're going to be the coolest teacher in the whole district." As they drove home through Brookhaven's familiar streets, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The accident had stolen his hands, his career, and his original identity. But it had also forced him to discover reserves of creativity, determination, and love that he might never have accessed otherwise. He had learned that strength isn't measured by what you can hold in your hands, but by what you refuse to let go of. And what he had refused to release was his son's future and his own capacity to serve others. That evening, as they settled into their usual homework routine, Leo working on a creative writing assignment while Daniel provided guidance and encouragement, the living room felt like the most natural classroom in the world. Outside, Brookhaven continued its quiet rhythm of ordinary lives and modest dreams. Inside, a father and son were proving once again that love combined with determination could transform any limitation into a launching point for extraordinary achievement. The story would continue, new students to help, new methods to develop, new families to inspire. But the foundation was solid now, built on the unshakable truth that some bonds are strong enough to turn catastrophe into opportunity, and some love is powerful enough to redefine what's possible for everyone it touches. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.